Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. Welcome to 2019. Now I thought that since I had recently done an episode where I read the entirety of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, that next I would take a look at Machiavelli's The Art of War, a far lesser known work than The Prince. Now since Machiavelli's version is a little bit too long, I thought instead I would just offer a short review and primer on the subject overall. Now, this text was likely first published in around 1520, and it takes the style of one of the old Greek style of Socratic dialogues, where you have a conversation between two characters. Now, Machiavelli was an extraordinarily clever individual. He had experience in both politics and in military affairs. He understood that politics was basically the continuation of warfare by other means, but he also brought a new understanding to politics and war, where he understood that you could use warfare and the military and this sort of propagandistic style that's used in the military, that could also be brought to political affairs or political uses. Now, the overall intent of the book was put into the mouth of one of the characters inside that most people seem to identify with, Machiavelli himself. And it's stated here, "To honor and reward virtue, not to have contempt for poverty, to esteem the modes and orders of military discipline, to constrain citizens to love one another, to live without factions, to esteem less the private than the public good." And I think therein lies a lesson for many of our communalists and collectivists who seem to have louder and louder voices online these days. Anytime you're consistently and repeatedly aligning yourself with this so-called public good, if you're constantly aligning yourself with this collective notion or communalist notion over and against the private sphere or the individual, you're simply being Machiavellian. And this really was something that was a new development during this era. This was not how things had commonly been from Greek times up until then. Machiavelli really represents a rather revolutionary take on how things have been, and the entirety of the modern world actually is very much Machiavellian. And this is drawn out in some of the works of Dr. Benjamin Weicker, who's I would really strongly advise people read what Dr. Weicker has to say about the work of Machiavelli, even if Machiavelli oftentimes was simply trying to placate people who were above him in the overall social structure. Many times the truth about how the world developed since then came out in the works of Machiavelli. Another component that's important to understand when you're thinking about Machiavelli's version of the Art of War is he did not mean art in the sense of art the way we think of the term art. He actually meant it in terms of a profession. And further, I would urge caution against those who try to pretend that there's some sort of significant disjuncture between Machiavelli's The Art of War and his work in The Prince. There are a number of people out there who try to say that these things are utterly and entirely different, but he has a quote in The Prince that goes as follows: "A prince should have no other object, nor any other thought, nor take anything as his art but that of war, and its orders and discipline, for that is the only art which is of concern to one who commands." And also for the people who think that he's not very much of a military theorist or strategist or tactician, in times past he was often ranked alongside Caesar and Polybius in terms of that as basically being considered an authority on particular venues of military affairs and interactions, not just political theory. And to continue here, it's also important to understand that Machiavelli's The Art of War is entirely within the humanist tradition of writing. It's entirely practical in its considerations of arguments. Also of note is that within this text, he was arguing for what today we would refer to as civilian supremacy, such as having a commander-in-chief, basically, over military affairs, rather than just having people with military interests or the military-industrial complex style interests over military affairs, because then they would very frequently be redirecting the state's concerns and actions constantly towards warfare rather than perhaps more civilian interests. Now, I would argue that although that was an important idea, it has largely turned out to be a failure over time, as we have seen that the military-industrial complex and the technocratic and bureaucratic elite have basically taken over the entirety of this structure through the regulatory and administrative state practices and whatnot, but I guess it at least was a good idea at the time, shall we say. And beyond simply the title, there are other elements of this that link together Machiavelli's Art of War with Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Probably the most important aspects of that is about how he continually suggests that one should engage in the use of surprise and distraction in order to achieve deception. And he also has a very interesting advice where he tells rulers basically to claim at various times that, well, they had a vision, that if you're going to be going into combat the next day and you're really concerned about what the outcome might be, well, one great way in order to motivate your people or to motivate your troops, to motivate your soldiers, is to basically say that you've had some kind of a foresight. You've been granted some special vision as to what is going to take place the next day, and then this will serve to, enhance the fighting endurance of your troops, and maybe they'll go on to victory very soon thereafter. And as I mentioned once already, he really did prefigure Clausewitz's, formulation and understanding that politics is the continuation of war by other means. Machiavelli actually saw this early on, even in the 16th century. He was already on to this notion. Another thing that's important about Machiavelli is to understand that he counseled rulers that even if they were not particularly religious, say if they were deists or something like that, or had other deeper questions about religion that they didn't want to ask, they most certainly should never broach any of that in public, that they ought to at least pretend to be a deep and abiding believer. That way it would help them to control and discipline and, basically manipulate the public's belief in religion even more so. In order to write The Art of War, Machiavelli pulled upon two of his prior experiences. One was where he served as the secretary of the militia, and another was where he had served as the chancellor of the republic itself. And he was always a big believer in the concept of the republic, and that one should always work to achieve glory for the republic rather than oneself. And before we get to the actual 27 rules of war that Machiavelli drew out, this can be found in several different places, but other stuff that we're going to address before we get to that is that he had a strong emphasis on the use of citizen soldiers. He really wanted the people to be committed to the area in which they lived rather than mercenaries, which had been used at so many times in the past. He felt that the use of mercenaries really would reduce their interest in actually being involved in conflict for the particular republic, wherever it was, because mercenaries can be either garnered within a nation or within a particular state area, or they could be brought in from other areas, and then those people he considered to be far less trustworthy. Another thing that he believed and that he advanced within this book was the idea that the military itself was sort of a representation of or expression of the power of the leader, and that the leader could then use this politically to their own advantage. The more powerful their army is, the more sort of social prestige that they have on the broader world stage, the more this could be used by a political leader themselves to build themselves up. Machiavelli also reviewed some of the conspiracies that were involved in the assassination of Caesar, but he also went so far as to sort of intimate or even advise the use of the notion of assassination on internal enemies. Another notion that he discussed in the book was the idea of expansion by warfare, or the idea of expanding one's political power through spreading out one's own empire. He also advocated the use of control through fear, or the idea of imposing obedience and faith as a weapon against the people in order to basically retain their loyalty. And just a few other aspects of the text is that he advocated the use of sort of narrative structures, basically the use of stories, or basically generating maybe fictional characters even, in order to enhance people's loyalty and commitment to the Republic. He also pointed out that mistakes of history are often repeated because people do not read or understand history. And another thing that he sort of basically romanticized and glorified the concept of war and triumph throughout this text. And like many people in his time, he took a rather dim view of human nature. He was rather pessimistic about it, especially when it came to political and military affairs. He was always distrustful of people, especially people on the outside, but also people on the inside as well, which is why he contemplated the possible use of assassination against internal enemies. He essentially took the view that war is something that's basically inevitable, that it's always going to come out and repeat over and over again. Warfare will also be limited if the objectives are not too broad, but that it could also go over into total warfare if it was necessitated. He also believed that war, if it were meticulously planned enough, it could actually be used for what he considered to be socially useful purposes. And although he was using this typical Greek style of dialogue from the classical ages, the people who he always pointed out should be the exemplars that everyone should look to in terms of mimicking their leadership styles and abilities were actually Roman rulers. So now we'll move on to Machiavelli's 27 Rules of War, and I will link the PDF below. It'll be found in book 7 there, but I'm going to take this actually from a short article from Ryan Evans over at warontherocks.com, where he wrote Machiavelli's 27 Rules of War, basically in a boiled down format. This is from August 3rd, 2014. And I will link to this below as well. 1. What benefits the enemy harms you, and what benefits you harms the enemy. 2. Whoever is more vigilant in observing the designs of the enemy in war and endures much hardship in training his army will incur fewer dangers and can have greater hope for victory. 3. Never lead your soldiers into an engagement unless you are assured of their courage. Never make an attempt unless you see they hope for victory. 4. It is better to defeat the enemy by hunger than with steel. In such victory, fortune counts more than virtue. 5. No proceeding is better than that which you have concealed from the enemy until the time you have executed it. 6. To know how to recognize an opportunity in war and take it benefits you more than anything else. 7. Nature creates few brave men. Industry and training makes many. 8. Discipline in war counts more than fury. Number 9 is rather extensive, but basically it boils down to the concept that you can accept deserters from the enemy camp. 10. It is better in organizing an engagement to reserve great aid behind the front line than to spread out your soldiers to make a greater front. 11. He is overcome with difficulty who knows how to recognize his forces and those of the enemy. 12. The virtue of the soldiers is worth more than a multitude, and the sight is often of more benefit than virtue. 13. New and speedy things frighten armies. While the customary and slow things are esteemed little by them, you will therefore make your army experienced and learn the strength of a new enemy by skirmishes before you come to an engagement with him. 14. Whoever pursues a routed enemy in a disorganized manner does nothing but become vanquished from having been a victor. Number 15 essentially says if you don't make provisions to be able to eat, you're going to be defeated even without the use of steel. 16 is rather awkwardly formulated, but basically boils down to the concept of how the location for battle is chosen. 17, if you want to see whether a spy has come into your camp during the day, have no one go into their quarters. 18, change your proceeding when you become aware that the enemy has foreseen it. 19, counsel with many on the things that you ought to do and confer with few on what you do afterwards. 20, when soldiers are confined to their quarters, they are kept there by fear or punishment. Then when they are led to war, they are led by hope and reward. And 21, it sounds very much like something straight out of Sun Tzu's Art of War. 21, good captains never come to an engagement unless necessity compels them or opportunity calls them. 22, act so your enemies do not know how you want to organize your army for battle, and in whatever way you can organize them, arrange it so that the first line can be received by the second and by the third. 23, in a battle, never use a company for some other purpose than what you have assigned to it unless you want to cause disorder. 24, accidents are remedied with difficulty unless you quickly take the facility of thinking. 25, money, still, money and bread are sinews of war, but of these four, The first two are the most necessary, for men and steel can find money and bread, but money and bread cannot find men and steel. 26. The unarmed rich man is the prize of the poor soldier. 27. Accustom your soldiers to despise delicate living and luxurious clothing. And that also echoes some of the things that you heard in The Art of War. If you haven't listened to that one yet, by the way, I'll link it below so you can go back and check it out. But I hope that this has been a helpful little primer just on basically an introductory bit. If you're ever going to read Machiavelli, either The Prince or The Art of War, I can actually link both of those below so you can check them out in PDF format. And certainly if you enjoyed this particular episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.